Hey guys, I'm Alice Hardinge and I'll be doing part 2 of this presentation, which is human rights in illiberal democracies, specifically focusing on Vietnam. So before we go into focus on Vietnam, we need to ask what actually is an illiberal democracy and how does it interact with human rights. So illiberal democratic regimes are democratic in nature, but they may not be constitutionally liberal. So Dr. Farad Zakaria gives a really good definition, and he says that illiberal democracies are democratically elected regimes. They're often ones that have been re-elected or reaffirmed through referenda. However, they routinely ignore constitutional limits on their power and deprive their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. So there's democratic countries, liberal democratic countries, there's liberal democracies, and then there's states that slip into autocracies and are ruled by dictatorships, for instance. So an example of a liberal democracy is Vietnam, also Hungary, and they're often semi-authoritarian in nature, and they don't want to engage with the kind of pro-liberal, very Eurocentric approach of human rights endorsement. So you could look towards a conditionality principle there, which I believe will be spoken about in the next section. Yeah. So the world of human rights is filled with lots of grey areas because Western countries do not consistently and completely promote democracy and human rights, and non-democratic countries cannot be defined as favouring autocracy either. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance in this issue, which can be lost in the overarching concepts. But basically, in a liberal democracy, because the state has more power and has certain characteristics, it inherently does limit and restrict human rights that are applicable to the citizens of that country. So there's 15 characteristics that were recorded by Dr. Farad Zakaria as well in his article, The Rise of Liberal Democracy. And he classes these 15 things as examples of when an illiberal democracy is starting to rise, or like the establishment of a liberal democracy. So it's the consolidation of power in the executive. It has to be, it could be a charismatic leader, and also the erosion of the independence of the judiciary, the weakening status of parliament, the recourse to direct democracy, so plebiscites and referenda, lots of populist rhetoric and propaganda, discrimination of minorities, which is another human rights issue, media and internet censorship, curbs on academia and educational curricula, targeted repression of opponents, restricted on freedom of speech and assembly, and disregard for the rule of law, and misuse of the state's resources, and forging of external enemies. And liberal democratic regimes are often semi-authoritarian in nature and resistant to Eurocentric liberal advances like the conditionality principle utilised by the European Union to endorse Western values and human rights reform. Yeah, so within illiberal democracies, although you will have lots of countries coming in trying to push for human rights development and progress, there is often a large degree of resistance in autocratic and semi-democratic states. Yeah, so as previously mentioned, the liberal states could be seen as a barrier to human rights promotion. Gilbert and Mossini argue that the promotion of human rights in the global south by Western powers can elicit a reaction from liberal states that perceive challenges to their geostrategic interests. So liberalism advocates and human rights promoters will often target pro-liberal groups within a semi-democratic region and prompting the illiberal regimes to react. And it's a lot of conditions, as mentioned before, where it's only on condition that the states take steps to either improve human rights conditions or perhaps enact certain legislations or decree certain liberties, then they may be, able to receive a loan or, have more trade partners. It's kind of, the carrot and the stick approach, which, as I mentioned before, will be explained in the next part. But overall, illiberal states, just in their nature, are a barrier to human rights due to the lack of freedom of expression. And this can be seen particularly in Vietnam at the moment, especially in the last few years, as a lot of their human rights have been further restricted from what already was quite an authoritarian regime. So in Vietnam, the Communist Party monopolizes its power through the government, and it controls all major political and social organizations within the country. And in a Human Rights Watch report in 2019, it was said that basic civil and political rights, including freedom of expression, association, and peaceful public assembly, are extremely restricted. And dissidents also often reacted with a lot of violence. So activists in Vietnam, whether that be like freedom of speech activists, human rights advocates, those that are speaking up and challenging the government as democracy slides further and further away, they are often beat up, thugs are sent to hit them, and they receive a lot of oppression from the state. Police often use excessive force as per peaceful public protests, and there's just a huge level of resistance and then reactive action from the government when that resistance appears. Yeah, so this is just a video about what's happening with human rights at the moment in Vietnam, and we can watch it now, or I'll just leave you the link. And yeah, in Vietnam, as I mentioned before, activists and people that are speaking out are actually having people sent after them. And although there's less political prisoners now in Vietnam, there's a higher level of kind of underground attacks going on those that are willing to speak out. Yeah. So after I was going to show the video, I was going to do a little activity with the class, which would have been a Kahoot quiz. So in the Kahoot quiz, there would have been like little pop-ups of what definitions would be, and it'd be like a challenge and all the different like histories of when human rights first developed, etc., etc. And it would have been like a 5-minute activity or so. It's a bit hard to describe with the video. Yeah, that was the intention. Yeah, thank you for watching, and yeah, I hope you are doing well. Thank you.